Welcome to Collaboration Beyond the Buzzword. These are interviews with pioneers in deep collaboration. My name is Winthrop Pardee and I'm the host. And today I'm so happy to be here with Karen Ansara, who is a longstanding colleague and friend who has been with her husband, Jim, a grant maker for many, many years, especially in Haiti, all focused on helping to end poverty in the developing world. In addition to her own philanthropy, Karen launched and has been the chair of the board of NEID Global. That's the network of engaged international donors. Some of you may have known it from its previous name, New England International Donors. It is now Network of Engaged International Donors. And for full disclosure, I've been a longstanding member of NEID and am also currently on the board. And maybe because of that, I can attest to what Karen has enabled, which is this incredible, remarkable network of donors that continues to evolve in a very robust and dynamic way. And I don't use those words lightly. I've seen many, many changes as the world changes and as the needs change. And we're continuing to change into the future. So with that, I just want to welcome you, Karen.
Thanks, Winthrop. It's really a joy and privilege to be in conversation with you.
Thank you. Well, let's just get started. So let's go maybe back a bit. And so why did you originally, as a philanthropist, lean into collaboration and systems thinking with your own philanthropy? What brought you to that place?
Well, I think like a lot of individual donors, my husband and I started out with a small family foundation. And we had a very eclectic mission, but a central focus of it was to support vulnerable and orphan children in the developing world. And that came from our own experience adopting 4 children, 3 of whom are girls from Latin America. And so we wanted to give back, but we also wanted to really address the kind of deprivations that result from being born into extreme poverty. But we were making grants to orphanages and programs for these children. And, soon, it wasn't long before I realized we can't support all the orphans in the world. So how can we get to the root of the problem? And what's the root of the problem? Well, poverty, of course, is at its core. And then the question was, well, what causes poverty? And of course, that's different in each context. But that brought me to things like, lack of job training, lack of access to loans, lack of land or even the right to own land, gender-based violence, stifling gender norms, climate-forced migration, political instability, lack of access to reliable contraception, political voice. I mean, it just went on. And I thought, how am I going to learn about all these things? How am I going to decide where I can make a difference? So I went to a great network, to a conference run by an organization called Grantmakers Without Borders, where I learned a lot, but they only met once a year. And a lot of the folks there were professional grant makers with advanced degrees in their own area of expertise, not new and emerging donors like me. And I needed something more. I realized that. I needed both the learning, but I also needed the community because I live in a small rural town and I couldn't talk about my passion for building latrines in Nicaragua at my local cocktail party or my excitement about funding education for girls in Afghanistan. I needed to figure out how I could be with people who could both support my own passion, but also stretch me. And that meant relationships and community. So, as you've created this podcast, I think, to talk about systems change, and these were all systemic issues, complex issues that I knew I couldn't fully understand or solve on my own, because one intervention alone, that's not going to end poverty or keep parents from feeling so desperate they have to surrender their children. So I really wanted a community that would support me, inspire me, stretch me. But what really lit a fire in me was when I heard that only 2% of all the donations in the United States went to solve global problems, went to solve the kinds of things that were keeping me awake at night. And I thought, what are we going to do about this? And so I went to the head of Grantmakers Without Borders and said, what can we do? And we decided that we would start by creating a support group in the New England area where we were both based that would try to inspire others to invest globally, to solve global problems, and while doing, increase their effectiveness. So about 12 years ago, we got started with this. We've evolved now, and as you said, we're now the network of engaged international donors, or NEID Global, with 180 members, 60 grant-making institutions, over 100 philanthropists from across the country.
That's so wonderful, and it continues to grow. One thing I heard you just say was that this really the kind of the germinating force was this passion or shared passion to increase the level of international giving, and as let's say a purpose, explicit purpose, at the same time to do it in concert with others, right? So how did that evolve? How did it evolve so that you sort of brought people on board, and it grew, and what were maybe some of the aspects of NEID Global that sort of emerged through that evolving experience? Where it is today isn't where it was when it started, right? So there was a process there.
Right. Well, it was definitely incremental and iterative. At the very beginning, we had a group that strategized about how to create this network, and they said, don't pre-plan anything. Let's see what happens. Let the members take this and shape this according to what they need, right? So we've always tried to be that way, but over time, we've developed a platform of really substantive conversations, 50 silo breaking conversations about every issue you can imagine in international development from every geographic angle. But really, people come in for that substantive content, but what gets them coming back are the relationships. So I have seen hundreds of times the sparks that happen when someone comes into the room with another person that they've gotten to know and trust, and they're both excited about the same kind of work, or something completely different, but they appreciate each other's passion and life commitment for the work.
We one thing that we've bandied around a lot within NEID is growth at the speed of trust, right? The role of trust and the development of relationships within the network over time, that is what really can lead to those deeper collaborations, right? And I don't know if you have any kind of either vignettes or about that. I mean, I'm sure you do.
I do have some examples. We've had about 30 to 35 book discussions over the years. We always frame them with questions that try to elicit the donor's personal story, their journey in philanthropy. What brought you here? Would you invest in this kind of leader profiled in the book or not? And why? How does that connect to your own style of leadership, for instance? So that's been an angle we use. But we also don't shy away from difficult issues. We had a giving circle last year on global racial justice, okay, a highly sensitive issue. It was led by a phenomenal person with deep expertise, both personal and professional, with these issues. And we had to go to some very uncomfortable places. We had to create, opportunities for people to meet in pairs and in small groups to share some of their personal stories as well as the reactions to what's been said. When you do that, bit by bit, you create trust, vulnerability, and mutuality between people. And that's where the deepest learning occurs.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And so when you've talked about kind of the value of need to its members, and maybe we could stick with that a bit longer. It's obviously the getting out of your silo. It's learning, sort of parallel learning from people doing maybe something slightly different in the same geographic area. It's connecting to voices on the ground, and that's something that I know that increasingly NEID Global's been doing. And that brings up, of course, some challenges from the donor perspective to also be vulnerable in connecting with the people who are really making the change and who are being supported by donors. And it gets into the whole power dynamic issue. And wondering how, as a network, as a funder network, you see that succeeding, how to do that in a way that, and maybe as an example for other funder networks to emulate.
I'll give you an example from this week, Winthrop.
No.
So we featured a firebrand, Dagan Ali, who started an organization called Adesso and another one called NEAR. She's from Somalia originally, I believe.
Oh.
And her mission is to show how the international aid and humanitarian system is broken and racist and fosters colonial power dynamics, right? Where the former colonial or imperialist powers control the purse strings. They make the decisions about where the money's going to flow. They don't necessarily consult the residents of the countries where they're making their interventions. And let me tell you, it was uncomfortable to hear this. We had on the call about 75 people, including quite a few who are NGO leaders, because we open a lot of our events to people beyond our network because we want to create conversations. And it was hard, but I'm telling you, that conversation changed me. I'm going to always remember, am I acting in a colonial way with my grant? Is that really what I should be doing? Or is there a way that I can hear people from the ground talking about their lived reality? Can I not just invite them to the table, but have them set the agenda for what I should be doing?
Absolutely.
So those are the kinds of conversations we want to create more and more.
Now, maybe pivoting a little to kind of the impact of a network like NEID Global to the sector. So how do you see these practices that are maybe changing hearts and minds of the members themselves that then lead to potentially, hopefully, change practices in their grant making that better serve those communities in partnership? How do we take that and use that as a best practice and influence the sector? That's a challenge, right? Do you have any thoughts about that? Is that really part of your purview in your mind, or do you think it's more?
Indeed. Change the sector. We can't just engineer a top-down strategy, right? The whole point is we have a network and it's going to be iterative. We can't predict exactly what's going to happen. But when we pull our giving circles together, we have people from vastly different points in the philanthropic sector. And they come together, they learn deeply about an issue, they wrestle with it, they determine together what are the grant making criteria that we're going to use before we make our grants. One of the principles that we're emphasizing over and over again is, again, listen to the people on the ground. Value small, targeted grants that are highly contextual. And so that's what our folks are doing with these grants. It's $10,000 grants from this circle. But when they leave the circle, believe me, they're incorporating that strategy in their own grant making, in their own values. Another thing is that we have been focusing a lot on racial justice. We had an incredible speaker named Sir Hilary Beckles at one point from the University of the West Indies, who talked about the imperative of reparations from former slave trading countries to communities that were enslaved. That was a concept I had never, ever heard of before. And I really wouldn't have given a lot of credence to it, except there was a member of the network who had created a fund to promote reparations. That changed me too, so that I will be more open to funding in that direction. I mean, of course, Winthrop, we know we've got a huge problem with racism in philanthropy in general, including in the United States. I mean, the data that's come out from Echoing Green, for instance, has shown that far fewer grants and donations are made to organizations led by BIPOC individuals than by white folks, even if they're working in the same communities. So there's a bias there, and it is structural, and we have to address that both domestically and globally.
Let's maybe reflect a little bit more on some of the lessons that you've garnered from your journey through NEID Global over the many years. What are some of your main takeaways and thoughts that would help others who are building or joining or funding, particularly networks like NEID Global's?
Well, I have to tell you, I've really been influenced by two books. And the first one I'm going to share here. I'm going to do a little promo for Impact Networks by David Ehrlichman. And he makes a number of points about what makes for really powerful, effective networks. There's 4 of them. One is building bridges across divides, and another one is prioritizing trust-based relationships. Another is sharing leadership. And the 4th one is recognizing the inherent interconnectedness of our lives. So if I could just spell those out regarding NEID for a minute. I've come to believe that groundbreaking networks bring people together who wouldn't normally be in the same space, and they bring them together for mutual, authentic, trusting relationships, not transactional ones. I've been in many conferences and philanthropic settings where I feel like an object, not a human being, right? Not a peer. So we don't want that. We want mutual, authentic, trust-building relationships. Vibrant networks, they're also self-organizing. And that means that members of them can take the lead and they can go off and create their own collaborations. That's a little bit of a struggle I have found with NEID to hold together when you're trying to keep the whole network intact, but you want to create the platforms so that individual philanthropists can work together and create something new. And we're starting to do that with a terrific platform called Grapevine, which is the foundation for our giving circles and our 4 affinity groups. And lastly, I think really life-changing networks and norm-changing networks all help us realize that we are part of one another. My favorite theologian, Barbara Deming, said, "We are all part of one another." And another way of looking at that is the Ubuntu phrase, I am because we are. That's the concept of Ubuntu. Or Martin Luther King's phrase, looking at this another way, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are inextricable as human beings. And I also recognize more and more now that our suffering is collective. Our suffering is collective. When someone's suffering, in Afghanistan, that is affecting me. Now that's more than just a moral connection. It's a practical connection, right? We now have an influx of traumatized Afghans into our country. And fortunately, there are so many Americans who are responding with empathy and with practical support. But these problems from other parts of the world, they are not divorced from our reality anymore. You take climate change, for instance, the fires in California, the hurricanes in the Caribbean. We are all being affected indelibly by these situations. So the networks can help us determine how to respond. We can't always predict what's coming down the pike, but the networks of people who trust each other and have creative ideas, they can do that.
Yes, and on that point, maybe sort of two dimensions to that, I think, particular to donors, to philanthropists, and that is a sense of isolation, right? So you mentioned a lot of these events you go to where you feel that you're treated as an object as opposed to a human being. I often hear philanthropists, funders, say, I'm not an ATM machine. I don't want to be treated like an ATM machine or a walking dollar. I'm a human, and I have feelings. And so there's that dimension that maybe is specific to philanthropists. And then there's also the other part of what you were talking about, which is if these systemic problems are going to have systemic solutions or be tackled, they have to be tackled systemically, and that inherently entails networks
and
like
multi-sectoral approaches.
Exactly. So maybe taking on both, what is specific to, the silo breaking and relationship building, isolation, eliminating aspects of networks for philanthropists, and then also just, what it really means to take on these problems in a cross-sectorial, interdisciplinary way.
Well, so much of the philanthropic industry is broken into silos. There are many affinity groups based on global education or global human rights or global fund for children or, this or that. And we intentionally, from the very beginning, said, no, we're not going to perpetuate those silos. We're going to bring people together across silos so that they learn how the dimension of the problem that they have focused on for so long is inextricable from another dimension of the problem, but also to promote more creative thinking about how to solve those, of course.
But I don't, I think your perspective as a funder, as a donor in these networks, that's useful to kind of convey to others who share that unique challenge, ATM machine image problem. Just to be able to function, you have to kind of build up some walls there, right? To be able to just collect your thoughts and function, and then those walls end up becoming barriers to empathy and to understanding, right?
Yes, so absolutely they do. And so what I can comment on is just the importance of finding a donor network. There are many out there, like Women Moving Millions and the Philanthropy Workshop and Thousand Currents, and being in those situations where you can talk honestly about what it feels like to be a donor or a funder. And I love what you said. How you end up putting up walls, and you end up being transactional because there's just too much coming at you sometimes. But if you have a space where you can talk with someone else who's got a similar experience, you can help each other, encourage each other to still be human, to still be empathetic.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And maybe I would reference with NEID Global, we had a series of activities called the Heart of Philanthropy a few years ago. You remember that very well, obviously. And one thing I heard multiple people say is a lot of times people think because I have money, I don't have challenges, I don't suffer, I'm not human. And it's very isolating and lonely. We're all, if we're really going to practice empathy, everybody deserves to be in that space, right?
You should be interviewed, Winthrop. I mean it. Oh, wow. You could say that.
Well, I just heard that. I heard that. You agree with that, right? Is that your experience sometimes? How maybe people, some people sometimes just think maybe that you don't have life's challenges.
Because you're a person of privilege.
Yeah, right.
Right? And there's the dividing line.
That is a dividing line. And that's complex, right? Because it's all relative.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of grant seekers who are also people of privilege,
Mhm. Yeah.
but, the privilege is really who makes the ultimate decisions about where the money flows.
Hmm. Yeah. Good point.
But our personal privileges obviously shape how we make those decisions. And
Yeah.
that's what we have to become really aware of is how, how does our life and the biases that have resulted from that shape our decisions about where to invest money.
Yes, it's important. I agree with you that it's important for donors to have a safe space where they can be in conversation with peers and really open up about their own feelings. And we've seen how important that is. Can that, in some cases, however, if you limit yourself to that, you're creating an echo chamber in a way of you're still behind the wall. The donor grantee wall is still up, right? And you're having that safe space because you need it. How do you bring that wall down to have vulnerable conversations and to be able to listen? And I know that you mentioned that earlier, and certainly NEID Global has done a really good job of having those kinds of difficult conversations
Mhm.
and folks listening.
Well, from the beginning, we determined that we wanted four different kinds of members of this network. There would be the individual philanthropists and their families. There would be the grant making staff who would bring
Mhm.
tremendous expertise, philanthropic advisors, and impact investors. Now, they don't all have equal amounts of power, for instance.
Mhm.
Grant making staff, they're answering to their trustees. So, right there, by encouraging sharing amongst those folks, you start to talk about these power dynamics of who holds the purse strings and makes the ultimate decisions. But in addition, we have always wanted to bring those with lived experience into the conversation. It is much easier to do now that we have Zoom, right?
Mhm.
We have this virtual world, and we're bringing people in who are sharing their life stories and perspectives from their communities with us from Asia, from Latin America, from Africa. And so it's just so much more powerful than reading those perspectives in a grant proposal or in a white paper. It's
Mhm.
more emotional, and I think it stays with people more.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think what we're just to maybe summarize this last segment, what we're really talking about is that a network that creates a safe space
Hmm.
enables this kind of learning and this kind of necessary evolution of thinking that then leads to practices, different kinds of practices. And so they're not separate, right? And there's certainly plenty of discussions and academic fora about these necessary changes. But what you're arguing is that it's actually this kind of a platform that creates the possibility for those kinds of changes. And it's not just reading an article someplace and saying, oh, yeah, that's nice.
Right. You do need some kind of structure to
Mhm.
have a greater impact. Having the structure is important for continuity, for lifelong commitment. We all know that when we're in communities where people have a shared sense of values or a shared mission, we're much more likely to stay the course. We're much more likely to give it our all. And that's
Mhm.
what the network can provide.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you mentioned the word structure, and so one other important point seems to me that uh, these networks, it's not just a Facebook group and an occasional convening. There's a lot of structure. There's infrastructure. There's staff.
Mhm.
It requires a budget and a lot of backbone support. That's often very misunderstood. So maybe talking a bit about what do networks like NEID Global need to thrive?
We're hearing this everywhere, right? Organizations need unrestricted, multi year support that evidences trust in the leadership and the boards to design whatever the programs are going to be.
Mhm.
So that's first and foremost. It does require staff, right? Of course, you need staff to convene the speakers, the educational programs, but you also need staff to help make the connections between members. You can have a Facebook platform, or let's say a LinkedIn platform where you can message somebody, online. That's not nearly as effective as a staff person or an appointed volunteer saying, I would like to meet you and hear about what you're interested in, what your work is, because I bet you I know someone else in this network who shares the same interest and passion, and I would love to introduce you. That changes people. And that makes the network come alive. But you need some staff people, right, to make that happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you're going to do that weaving, right?
Absolutely. Network weaving.
Doesn't weave itself.
Well, there are, I think there are social networks we're a part of, right, where that weaving does happen on its own, but this is weaving for a purpose. This is an impact network we're talking about, where we want to make change in the world, and that does require intentionality and structure.
We don't measure the impact of networks in kind of this linear log frame fashion, right? So how do you identify or understand the value of a network without that? And how do we convince people that they shouldn't impose kind of a log frame structure to the value that networks create?
I have to tell you, this is a challenge. It's a challenge to raise money for networks when you're not presenting a strategic plan or the log frame that you talk about, or specific outcomes you want to achieve. As I've actually learned from you, Winthrop, the process is the product. We're investing in a particular process, and the outcome of that process are the relationships that develop. So let me give you some examples from NEID. A couple who founded and fund a wonderful scholarship program primarily for young women in Kenya meets through the network a man who funds a network of primary schools in Kenya, and they form a partnership so that these primary school graduates end up getting high school scholarships and going to college. Another example, a group of family foundations, some large, some smaller, joined together to create a platform to help welcome Afghan refugees into the US. Okay, that relationship is the outcome. Or you get a major family foundation that focuses on East Africa, partnering with two smaller family foundations to equally fund the provision of medical equipment to hospitals and clinics in East Africa. That partnership is the outcome, but it's really hard to measure. It's really hard. It's all qualitative assessments, to assess who's been connected to who and what's the strength of those relationships. I've been very excited to read in that Impact Networks book I told you about before that there are actually online tools to help us map the connections between network members, and we're going to look into those.
Yeah, no, that's great. And to your those are just wonderful examples. And if you were to think you're presenting to a potential investor or funder of a network like NEID Global's, you wouldn't be able to say, by X date, we will have these 3 collaborations in these places, and that you're kind of tracking it. That's exactly what we can't do. And you can't put a timestamp on that, and you can't predict exactly what it's going to be. You just have to have the belief, right? It's about faith.
It is about, to some extent we can, because we have giving circles. We know there will be grants, $40,000 to $70,000 in grants from those, but we don't know where they're going to go. And the most important impact is how the individual members of the circle have been changed, how their eyes have been opened, and what they will do for years to come based on the learnings that they gleaned from their peers in that giving circle. Unpredictable.
Totally.
But
And it gets back to
effects.
Right. I heard yesterday a wonderful saying. I don't know if it's common or not. It's not about the sea, it's about the ripple.
Ooh, love that.
Yeah. So we go from this kind of grandiose, predetermined thing to it ripples out there.
That's a Western mindset,
Mm.
right? In fact, your guests, last podcast I listened to of yours, your guests, Cynthia Rayner and Francois
Yeah,
Benici, talked about that industrial mindset that tells us here in the West, we have widgets and we have apparatus and we know what's going to be produced. That makes us feel comfortable here, but that's not the mindset in much of the world. And it's not the mindset that's going to get us to solve so many global problems.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, and we can map networks like NEID Globals to a different approach that's not industrial, but more based on, as Cynthia and Francois say, it's scaling relationships, right?
Absolutely. And those relationships really require empathy. Empathy is extremely hard to measure, but it's based on deep listening, first of all, and it's based on mirroring, really seeing yourself in the other person and adopting their experience into your own life.
Okay, so if we can't quantify the impact of networks like NEID Globals and the many others, um, what questions do we ask in order to assess the value of that network, either as a funder or as a participant or as a beneficiary of the network?
I think we have to ask questions like this. How did this network help me think about things in ways I never would have thought before? Or how did this network help me find partners to amplify my philanthropy in ways I never would have dreamed of before? Or how did this network actually change me in ways I never would have imagined before? But again, those are subjective questions. It's qualitative analysis, but that's where the real impact is.
Right. And what's really stands out from those questions is they're not transactional. You're not talking about quantify the number of business cards I got, or the money I gave or made. It's really the transformation of practice and the collaboration, right? So we're really talking here about learning through collaborating and changing oneself and changing the world.
Yes, we are.
Well, and you've that's been so much part of your journey, and it one of the many reasons why I'm such a big fan and admirer and privileged to be your friend and colleague. So, well, Karen, on that note, I just want to thank you so much. This has been an amazing conversation. I'm sure that others will really enjoy it. Thank you.
Well, I've enjoyed speaking with you and learning from you, Winthrop, for the last 10 years. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Karen.